You sound, dare I say, cautiously optimistic, which is a good sign. But we saw, like you said, those margins, there's slim margins in Congress right now. And this was highlighted most recently during that really nasty speaker fight between Kevin McCarthy and the GOP, that small faction of far right lawmakers. So let's start with him. How does he factor in here? Is he obviously one of the major players?
Who he is. I think there's a something about the debt ceiling is that elections and political futures are not won or lost based on a vote on the debt ceiling. But for Republicans, primaries, and for McCarthy himself, his future as speaker does depend on whether he wins or loses a political fight. And the debt ceiling is seen as a political fight. Now Kevin McCarthy, he perseveres and he won the speakership, but many people are asking at what cost? There's a sense that kind of the tail is wagging the Republican dog here, where the far right holds sway over whether Kevin McCarthy, of how Kevin McCarthy kind of negotiates on the debt ceiling. And so he's insisting on some reforms. And that's something that most Republicans get behind. But the question is, what are these reforms? And there's a difference here when you kind of go underneath the surface level of just requiring fiscal reforms. And so I've mentioned that some players to watch include Representative Chip Roy, who was one of the 19 holdouts in McCarthy's race for speaker. He's insisting on returning to fiscal year 2022 spending levels. So that's about a $130 billion cut in discretionary spending. And then he's also looking at some things, quote unquote, woke government policies. So he wants to kind of go against some of this IRS spending that Democrats had in last Congress, and he wants to bolster kind of the border wall spending. And so these are things that are very much political fights that aren't necessarily connected to the debt ceiling. And it's something that Democrats are just never going to go for. At the same time, there are some more moderate Republicans that McCarthy needs to ameliorate that aren't going to necessarily go along with Chip Roy. And so I focus on some people like Representative Brian Fitzpatrick, who's the head of the co-head of the Problem Solvers Caucus, or Dave Joyce, who's the head of the Republican Governance Group, as well as Dusty Johnson, who is the head of the Main Street Coalition. These are all conservative but governance-minded Republicans who aren't willing to go along with the Chip Roys of the world and are kind of going to push back if they see any demands that Republicans have as being too far-reaching and unlikely to get kind of Democratic support. And then between all of this, balancing the left and the right of the Republican caucus, McCarthy needs to rely on some of his leadership allies. So there are people like House Ways and Means Chair Jason Smith, who is really a far-right Republican in terms of the debt ceiling, but he's part of the team as a member of leadership, and he needs to kind of sell the far right on coming to a deal. And then there's someone like Representative Patrick McHenry, who is the head of the House Financial Services Committee. And he is someone who used to be the chief deputy whip. He's well respected. He's conservative, but he's also noted that we shouldn't be playing, hard and loose with the debt ceiling. And so he's just another important voice on McCarthy's side to try to get the party united on some sort of position that isn't necessarily anathema to Democrats in negotiations. So it's certainly, McCarthy is taking the right steps here in meeting with Biden and saying, we should have some sort of fiscal reforms, but the hardest steps are still ahead of him in trying to cultivate a position that can unify 218 House Republicans.
He's definitely in a precarious position. We saw this in January. Essentially, that group of 20 Republicans or so held that gavel hostage from him. So is he beholden to this group? And if so, will he have a tougher time negotiating with Democrats when the time comes?
Yeah, that's kind of the challenge for McCarthy, is that one of his concessions in becoming speaker was this thing called the motion to vacate, which is just a legislative tool for a member of Congress to seek a vote to oust the speaker. And he allowed for this motion to vacate to return with just one vote. And so again, it's as much about optics and politics as it is about kind of the debt. If some of these far right members feel like McCarthy is giving away their leverage on the debt ceiling for some sort of fig leaf reforms, and they're not happy with that, they could seek a motion to vacate. And they've said as much, Chip Roy has said as much, that if he's unsatisfied with some of the negotiations, McCarthy's job could be at risk. And McCarthy, his ambition was to be speaker, and here he is. But with such thin margins, he is in a precarious position, as you noted, that if he kind of seeks too much of a negotiation among a Republican Party that's intent on fighting, it's much different than Democrats. The Republican voters are more interested in fighting, even if that risks a default, compared to Democrats who are more interested in compromise. Then he could be at risk from his right flank. But at the same time, if he moves too far from the right, that then kind of alienates a few of the moderate Republicans who are left in the conference, and that could push some of them to do something called like a discharge petition, which goes around Republican leadership if they work with Democrats. And so it's kind of between a rock and a hard place right now. And so the goal over the coming months is to try to find some sort of unified position and try to sell that to both the right and the left flanks of the Republican Party as a good position and as a win if they can get some of these concessions, even if it's not as much as Republicans, the far right Republicans, are hoping to get.